Joey.
Hiya. Okay, so we're just waiting for Ed to get his laptop into the meeting so he can share his screen. This is now becoming a regular feature.
This is our thing. Yeah, it's a sort of a skit that we do at the beginning of every community call.
So maybe before we get started, does anyone have any burning Composer questions that they want to ask? Oh, Ed's in the meeting.
And enabling sharing. Yes, it's looking good. There we go. Okay, I'll get started on our first agenda item. So the first thing that we wanted to bring up on this call is to take a little look at issue number 912 in GitHub. This is an issue that we've raised to acknowledge a need to improve the clarity of what a new user should do upon discovering Composer. This sort of came out of a series of questions we've had in Rocket Chat of various new people joining the community and just kind of struggling at what they're actually meant to get started with. We've got a few different ways of consuming Composer, and we're at the moment kind of unclear about how you should go about using them. I mean, to demonstrate that, I will head over to our website and just give you an idea. We've got this try it out button on there, which launches you into the web version of the playground. That's pretty cool. The place it falls apart is if you go and learn more. And here you have kind of tutorials before installing. So if I'm looking to install, I reasonably might skip to installing. I've got quick start, I've got starting a runtime, I've got creating a connection profile, but down here there are some other things. There's local playground, running it online, installing Composer, getting started. They all sound like places I reasonably might start, and quite as you might expect, having looked at that, a few people have got stuck on this. So issue 912 is to say, let's sort this out, let's make it so that if I'm coming to the website as a brand new user and I'm willing to be guided through an experience of what order I should learn about Composer in and try it out, we'll provide you with as quick a possible way of getting set up with a local dev environment to be building your applications on top of. So scrolling down this issue a little bit, there's been a little bit of discussion gone on there already, but this is very much not decided the route that we're going to take yet, so feel free to jump in on this discussion. But Dan's post from 2 days ago is a really good one at kind of summarising latest thinking on where we might go with this. And what I've done for this bit on the call is to just sort of take what Dan has proposed in words and bullet points there and turn it into a bit of a kind of visual slide deck of the way that we're expecting people might want to go about experiencing Composer for the first time. So if I flick over to my slide deck, this is a special custom illustration featuring our community mascots, unofficial community mascots, the Conga Blocks. That's got nothing to do with the slides, I was just playing around with that before the call. But more importantly, this is kind of an explanation of what we're outlining in that issue. So there's this kind of step 0 to using Composer, which is that we've got stuff that lets you try it out before you install, and that's looking at using the web playground and a web browser connection profile. So both your instance of Composer and your ledger are running somewhere in a cloud that you don't need to care too much about. Step 1 is then to go and do a local install, and that will mean then running Composer and your ledger as Docker containers. So specifically the Composer Playground UI running in a Docker container and Hyperledger Fabric running in a Docker container as well, with those two things pointed at each other. So using a connection profile to get your Composer instance pointed at your Hyperledger Fabric instance. Step 2 is to then get yourself set up with the developer tools. So we recognise that the UI is there for people to learn how this thing works, import some samples, do a bit of testing. There's probably going to come a point where you want to start using the CLI tools and you want to start doing stuff in your IDE. So step 2 is going to be to go and use still that Dockerized version of Fabric that you got from step 1, but to then set yourself up with the Composer CLI tools. That includes stuff like the Angular and REST generators, I think are in the work item, but not on my slides. And then going and hooking yourself up with the IDE plugins optionally, if that's something you feel like. Then steps 3 to N is when you're really kind of on the open road of using Composer. So we're saying there's the option to try it before, there's a simple local install that gets you a Dockerized version of it running on your local machine. There's then getting your developer tools set up locally, and then after that we're going to be looking at extending that out through a bunch of tutorials for you to do stuff. But that's really the path that we're looking at. That try it, get it running locally with Playground and Fabric, and then set yourself up with the developer tools. That's all I have for this. That's just a kind of a visual version. I should probably stick that on the issue after removing that first slide. But that's just kind of articulating what it is that's in there. We wanted to bring this up on the call to give people the opportunity to be up to speed with what we're thinking on that and hopefully chip in. So if you've had or seen someone have a less than optimal experience of getting started for the first time, tell us about it on Rocket Chat, tell us about it on this issue, and this issue is there to say we as a community should sort out that first time experience and make sure it's really, really smooth and obvious what you should be doing.
So does anyone on the call have any comments on this?
Just one question, quick question. This is John. Why the use of a ledger versus Fabric?
We're just trying to be general because we're Hyperledger Composer rather than Fabric Composer, and whilst at the moment we've got ourselves working with connection profiles for Hyperledger Fabric, we don't want to preclude the possibility that other Hyperledger blockchain implementations could be supported, and we'd love to see community members working on other types of connection profiles.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions or feedback on the getting started process at the moment? Okay, so I think next up was Liam, but are you ready?
No.
Okay, so we will jump to Dan to discuss the historian work.
Oh, can I use your screen share? Is it still sharing?
I think it's still sharing. You
Yep.
still see
Yep.
the screen?
Just search on historian. Thank you. Dan Selman here. So we are starting to think about a story which is kind of a version 2 of the transaction registry, which we've given the slightly grandiose name of historian. And let me find the story. It is 55 in GitHub. So there's some text there that describes the issue at a high level. Essentially, what we're trying to do is somewhat tactical and somewhat strategic. So the tactical piece first. If you used the transaction registry, you've probably seen that although we have Node APIs to access it, they're not exposed through the Composer REST server. So all you can do in the Composer REST server is submit a transaction for processing, and a side effect of the processing of that transaction is that it ends up in the transaction registry. But there's no easy way for somebody who's coming into Composer through the REST API to then query the transaction and get details about it. So the tactical thing really is to expose the transaction registry through the Composer REST server. The more strategic thing and the more interesting thing is we also have seen requirements where people need to know what were the side effects of processing a transaction. So a client submits a transaction, I don't know, it's a house purchase or something, And during the execution of the transaction processor function for that transaction, a bunch of assets get updated, some assets get deleted, some assets get created. And the end user would really like to capture all those side effects so that they can then perhaps run analytic reports over them or analyze the transactions for compliance purposes. So we have some existing code that's able to capture those side effects of running a transaction in the runtime. So what we could do is we could attach those side effects to the transaction entry in the transaction registry. And that's really what we're talking about here in terms of this historian. It would go beyond just a set of transactions keyed by their transaction ID to something richer where you could say what transactions have been processed, and then for a given transaction get some metadata back about what happened during the processing of that transaction. And there are some design questions listed in the issue, particularly around the size of this historian. If all we're doing is appending transactions to it, we probably need to allow people to perhaps decide what data they want to store in the historian. Maybe some transaction types are more interesting than others from a historian perspective, or perhaps have some declarative mechanisms to prune the history that's being managed by the historian. That's the gist of it. Any questions or comments? Particularly around the requirements. That would be very interesting to us.
This is Renee Bostic. I have a quick question. So, someone had asked, it appears, right, was can you expose the Composer registry through the REST API? Is that what was the original concern?
Yeah, that's the tactical part of this story. So that's relatively easy to do and not too disruptive. But our feeling is that doesn't go far enough. That most of the use cases that we've seen need more than just a transaction or a set of transactions that have been processed in the past. They need a bit more metadata about what happened when we processed the transaction.
Okay, and so now that I have this historian capability, how do that, is it still managed through the certificate keys? How do I access this historian record?
Yes, all this data is in the world state and is tracked on the blockchain. So it's accessed through the Composer APIs, just like all the other data.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Dan, this is John. With Fabric and the work in 1.0 around the ledger, is there also some work being done around this as far as more of easier capabilities to look at transactions, and now with read-write sets, you're going to be able to see more of that in the transaction log side of things?
I'll let Simon take that one. So the question is, what's changed in Fabric v1 at the underlying levels that might help support this story, I think.
Okay, so in the chain code APIs for Fabric v1, there's a new chain code method called getHistoryForKey or something along those lines, and it allows you to retrieve a list of all of the previous values for a given key in the world state. So for any specified key, you can see when it was initially created, which transaction created it, and then you can see when transactions have updated the value for that key, what value they set it to, and you can also see when subsequent transactions have deleted a key and whether or not it's been recreated since then.
So that's an interesting capability that we might end up exploiting, but it's very focused on the keys in the key value store, right? It's essentially saying, give me the history of changes for this given key in the world state, which is slightly different from the the level of abstraction that we're operating at for Composer. I think there are other APIs that allow you to walk the blockchain itself, right? And
yes, I believe the Fabric client SDK allows you to access that.
yeah, but again, that's that just allows you to essentially walk that linked list that is the blockchain. Whereas here, we would be saying what business transactions, if you like, have been submitted, and what assets were touched when we process those transactions.
Okay, it seemed like there's a little bit of an overlap with now you've got the world state tracking the transactions, but then you've also got the ledger that had all the transactions, and it seemed like the new architecture was storing a lot of that read-write set differences. And I didn't know if there was ways just to tap into that. If I had my understanding correct, and I may not have that all there.
I think you're right in that the data is there. The challenge is that the data is not in a form that's easily queryable or exploitable.
Okay.
So, for example, we haven't talked about another piece of work that we're doing based on around rich queries, but you could imagine querying the historian and saying, give me all transactions that updated, the color of vehicle 123, and it would give you back a set of transactions, and then you could then walk that set of transactions and see exactly what other assets were updated when that vehicle asset update occurred. And I think that would be quite hard to do with just the raw data that the blockchain is tracking.
Okay. Thanks.
I think there's another question in the issue, which is sort of to your point, is do we really want to store this metadata on the blockchain? I think there might be a scenario where you want Composer to build those historian entries, if you like, but you actually just want to emit them as events so that they can then be archived or put into a graph database where you can run even richer analytical queries on them. So that's also another interesting option, which also gets you around this problem of how much data do we keep and when do we evict the data. So I think we'll be thinking about some configuration options along those lines. Right? I might want to build historian entries and then immediately emit them, and then rely on an external system to run my analytics.
Mr. Guy, I have a question.
Yeah.
If applying this to Hyperledger Fabric specifically, and you look at the ledger being an aspect of a channel restricted to only specific, nodes having visibility. So, from Composer perspective, if the individual using Composer has access to different channels, will this historian aggregate information from all of those ledgers and all those different channels?
So no, it won't. It's sort of I don't think that's within Composer's remit to start collecting data from multiple deployed business networks and presenting it through a single interface. That sounds like a great idea for a separate monitoring or analytics tool. Or as Dan said, you could just take the events from all of the business networks and feed them into a single aggregator tool. There are various log aggregation tools that might be able to serve that purpose.
Or that could even be another blockchain, right?
Yeah.
You could aggregate all of your historian entries and process them as incoming transactions on another blockchain.
Right.
Or you put them in Apache Spark or some other big data analytics engine.
Okay.
Very for here, I came a little bit late, but I don't know if you covered or you can extend the support with the channels. I mean, I just heard a little bit about channels in this question, but What else do we have there that supports the channels in this version?
A couple of weeks ago, we released support for using Fabric V1 with Composer. The Composer connection profile for the Fabric V1 takes the name of a channel. That channel must exist. It must have been created by the Fabric administrator. And we will deploy the Composer business network and our generic chain code into that channel. One thing we're extremely interested in the future is being able to link between different business networks running in different channels, possibly in different blockchains, or even linking to data outside of different blockchains. But for now, our Fabric V1 support supports a single channel. But you can deploy multiple business networks to multiple channels. They just can't link themselves together.
Okay, thank you.
Do any other questions on the historian? Okay, so Liam has hopefully got ready to show us events.
See, bit of a warning. This is still in development. It's not been fully tested yet, so anything can happen, really. Probably will. Not much luck with sharing my screen. So this is regarding issue number 66. As a user, I can publish and subscribe to business events within a business network. So in terms of integrating the blockchain with other systems, it's quite important that we can actually capture the event. So Fabric 0.6 chain code emits events which are caught by the Node SDK, and the same is to be said for Fabric V1. So what we want to do is we want to have a continuous stream of these events through all of our connectors, our runtimes, and then all the way through to Playground. So what we currently have is we have that set up, that's currently working. So I'm going to give you a little demo of our current progress. If everyone can see my screen, is that?
Yep.
Excellent.
So what we're really interested in here is giving Composer users the ability to emit business events from their transaction processor functions. And what you'll see...
So you can see here, we have two events modeled. We have a basic one and a more complex one. This complex event could consist of concept, it could consist of relationships, but for now, I've just gone for basic properties. Now, we've modeled the event using this event keyword, and then we have an identified by field, and then this we take care of in the runtime. So to call one of these events, we model this in our transaction processor function. So you can see in this onCreate event, we're creating a basic event, and we simply call the factory, we call the new event method, and we create an event as we would an asset, or as we would a relationship, or as we would a resource. So I can show you one of these running. Go to submit transaction and just create event. That's important. So I was going to remind about the emit. So in the transaction processor function, we define our event, and then it's important that we emit the event. This emit, essentially in the runtime, stores that event in a buffer, and then eventually at the end, since the chain code can only emit one event at a time, it will emit every event in one array, and then the runtime takes care of emitting the events individually. So if we now go and submit this transaction, we can submit a create event transaction, give it some value. And we can see that this has then gone through the runtime. Sorry, it's gone from Playground to the proxy, then to our connector server, and it's gone all the way through to a... Can you guys see this? Is this all?
I just got kicked off the meeting.
Excellent. So this has then come through into Playground, and then we subscribe to this event through the business network connection, just using the basic JavaScript event emitter, and you can see that these are emitted into our log now. Current bug, as we can see, we've got two events being emitted at once, but you basically get the picture, you get the general idea. So the next steps regarding the events is We're going to unit test all the code that we have so far, and then we're going to create some scenario tests to make sure this doesn't happen. Any questions?
Yes, this is Sandy. This event that you have created is just an asynchronous event, right? Basically, you just trigger that event, but the chain continues, the transaction continues. So you're not blocking.
Yes, so every time a block is committed, the transaction can emit one event. So if once the block is emitted, once a block is committed, a transaction will be emitted. So you won't, essentially, if the transaction fails, you won't see an event emitted.
It's transactional.
Can this be used when I'm accessing specific data that automatically it will trigger an event notification?
Not yet, no.
No, so something we'd be interested in is automatically emitting like system events or composer events that are sort of generic, that just say an asset has been updated or a participant has been issued with an identity. So we're certainly interested in those sort of automatic events, but what we've built first is the ability to publish business events that you model and you're responsible for publishing.
That seemed like the most flexible thing because that allows you to, have very conditional events. Maybe when I receive a cash withdrawal for over $5,000, then I want to emit an event, and I can do that conditional logic inside my transaction processor function.
Excellent. That's exactly what I was looking for. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is a feature that a lot of people have been waiting for and asking for on Rocket Chat because it sets up that bi-directional link, right? We've been able to push transactions onto the blockchain for a long time, but it's up until now it's been difficult for the blockchain to notify external systems when something interesting has happened. So we think this is going to really help with that second use case. And it's worth sort of pointing out, it's all going over the Fabric event infrastructure. So Composer is calling the underlying Fabric APIs to actually publish the event to the peers and to the event hub.
Will there be some examples or samples provided of these events in action of actually doing something, sending some kind of notification or exchanging with some system or?
Yeah, so one of the next steps is to go through all of our documentation and make sure these are covered thoroughly, and then to add them into our vehicle lifecycle demo.
Okay, thanks. I'll look forward to seeing that.
So do we want to stick our neck up and set out and say when it's likely to show up?
It is, so event support is likely to be included in a release the week after next, after consensus. So normally we'd release every week, but for the end of next week, we're not going to do that due to the consensus event. We want to keep things stable due to the hackathon that's running at the weekend, where we're hoping a lot of people will end up using Composer. But it will be coming very soon after that.
And it should show up in unstable even sooner. Any feedback or questions? Cool.
No? Okay, we'll move on to REST API security. So this is issue 142. Can people see the screen? Great. So to give you some background, for those of you that have used the Composer REST server, you will have found that it doesn't offer many features in the way of security. When you start the Composer REST server, you give it a connection profile name, a business network name, and an identity, an enrollment ID and secret that the REST server can use to connect to the business network. Once the REST server is up and running and it's discovered the structure of the business network, any REST API calls that it receives are serviced using the same blockchain identity, the enrollment ID and secret that you started the REST server with. So there's no way from a transaction processor function or the access control rules to be able to differentiate between different clients of the REST API. Has anyone hit this problem yet? It might not have come up in your testing so far.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a feature that we're looking for down the road. So I knew it wasn't there. So very glad to see this issue open.
Great. So there's two parts to this this story. There's authenticating the users of the REST API, and we need to be able to have users log in to the REST API and authenticate themselves so we can identify individual users. And to do that, we're using a library called Passport. I'll just bring it up. So it's an open source library. It's used in multiple open source applications. And the very interesting thing about Passport is that it supports over 300 different strategies for authenticating users with other authentication systems. So for example, you can see on the screen here that there's a Passport strategy for authenticating with Facebook, with Twitter, with Google Mail, but also enterprise authentication systems such as SAML. I believe there's an LDAP strategy as well, and also client certificate support. And this is important because not all users of the REST server will necessarily know that they're interacting with a blockchain. They might not even know there's a blockchain behind the system they're using. For example, let's say all the farmers that are using an application to track the movement of animals, they might just want to sign into the application with their existing social media IDs, their Facebook ID, their Google Mail ID, etc. Or if you're in an enterprise, you probably want to sign on with your enterprise account. So we've taken the Passport library and plugged it into Loopback, which is the framework used by the REST server to build REST APIs. And now you can configure the REST server to use any of these Passport strategies to authenticate users. You don't have to pick just one, so one instance of the REST server can provide access to multiple strategies, so you can have a REST server that accepts either Facebook, Twitter, or Google Mail users, and it will handle the authentication for all of those at the same time. So before I continue with the blockchain piece, is there any questions on that side of things?
Yeah, listen, Guy, this is interesting from a broader perspective along identities. And I see this a lot, not just here, I think we're leveraging ideas already in social media where people are constantly logging with their social media into websites. And it has me thinking there's this notion of we're just extending 10 degrees of separation from real identity, and how much do we trust the other social media sources of identity? Are we just going along with this, or should we be questioning the validity of some of these identities? Or is that maybe not an appropriate question to ask in this case? I just wanted that out.
So I think that's a pretty big sort of policy question, I would say. I think one data point in that area would be the secure key implementation, which is very interesting. So it's a partnership between IBM and various banks, and it's building out an identity platform where your identity is, the banks essentially assert for your identity. So I suspect identity platforms in general are a very hot topic at the moment, and I suspect as we see more of these distributed blockchain solutions, the issue of identity is going to get more and more prominent. You might also have seen that recently there's a new Hyperledger project called Indy, from the sovereign group, and that's adding an identity platform to the Hyperledger Foundation itself. But I think, even if those things exist, I would expect that some bright spark will come along and they'll write a Passport.js strategy, for Indy or for secure key, right? And that would allow you to use that as an authentication mechanism for the REST server.
And I'll just follow up on the Indy part. At the recent Hackfest in DC, I was able to sit down with the developers of Indy and talk about how we could possibly bring Indy and Composer closer in the future. And there are some exciting possibilities about how we could use features in Indy to provide authentication of users, but using things like zero-knowledge proofs. But I think that's probably a while away yet. That's still very early days with that.
Yeah, that would be good to stay close to that, because I'd be excited to kind of get a focal point of what's there's so many projects out there in general trying to solve the identity problem, and some are just selfishly, just for their own self-interest, trying to achieve like identity, a central source of identity like a stone there, which I think is just nonsense. But for those who are really trying to solve the identity problem, and maybe the easiest is taking the right approach, that would be exciting.
So one thing I'd recommend is that there is an identity working group under Hyperledger, which has meetings every other week, where they discuss identity in detail across all of the Hyperledger projects. So if you're interested in identity, I'd really recommend getting involved with that.
All right, thanks.
This is Danny again. I apologize for asking so many questions. When you talk about I'm doing a REST API call, I'm doing a REST API call for an external system.
So this is doing a REST API call to a running instance of the Composer REST server, which you will have set up and connected to your business network.
Okay. And the reason I'm asking this question is the transaction is sessionless, and I think that what I'm trying to say is if I'm gonna doing REST API calls to two different systems, it might be very well that would require two separate identities, right? It should be two separate passwords, if you will. So I'm wondering, just for the long term, because I've done a lot of REST API calls to different systems, and usually I'm compelled to integrate different passwords or different user IDs.
Okay, so you'll be able to use, so each instance of the Composer REST server connects to a single business network, and you will be able to use passport strategies to authenticate to multiple REST servers if you want, and they could all be using different passport strategies. But at the end of the day, we have to map the external user ID to a blockchain user ID and certificate that we can use to sign transactions and submit to the blockchain.
So this question that you posed right now is going to be a very common and popular implementation to a lot of our customers.
Yeah, yes, I hope so. Now there is an issue of trust. You have to trust the REST server to sign transactions on your behalf and perform the mapping between the external user ID, like your Twitter handle, and your blockchain certificate. And that's because we need a certificate in order to sign the transaction that we submit to the underlying fabric. And today we do not have the technology for getting away from that problem. If that sort of privacy issue is a concern, then the solution is to bring the Composer client APIs and run everything on your local machine that you do trust. So that's another reason why these link-ups with projects such as Indy are really interesting to us, because it allows us to have use a REST server but not necessarily trust that REST server. And that issue of trust sort of implies that there will probably be multiple REST servers servicing a single business network. For example, there are multiple organizations on a single business network. Each organization will probably have an instance of the REST server that their employees trust. and they go through their REST server, which is then connected to the blockchain. So just to finish up on the part where we map the external ID to the blockchain identity. And to handle this, we've introduced the concept of a wallet, which we're using elsewhere and is a familiar term in the blockchain space for storing your credentials, your enrollment ID, and your enrollment certificate in the REST server. Each user has their own wallet, and users cannot access other users' wallets, which is very sensible. And when an external user makes a request to the REST server, we look up their identity from the wallet, their wallet, and we use that to sign transactions on their behalf. So the identity is passed all the way through. So we take their Twitter ID, we map it to a blockchain ID, and then the Composer runtime running inside the blockchain is able to determine who submitted the request and perform the appropriate access control around that participant. Now, the wallets themselves are stored in the REST server, but they're modeled using loopback, which means you can use any loopback connector to persist that data. You want to store that data in a database rather than on the local file system, for example. So you're able to use any of the loopback connectors to do that. One of the examples that I'm yet to get around to documenting is that you can use the REST server to persist the credentials inside a Mongo database. And at that point, you can scale up the REST server to multiple instances, and they all point at the same persistent backend storage in this shared Mongo database for storing the credentials. So there's going to be a lot of documentation and samples coming this way to explain this feature. But I definitely welcome any feedback or questions.
How do you see the REST server? You mentioned that each organization in the network could potentially stand up their own. How do you see that happening? Is that going to be a NPM? Is that going to be Docker? Is that something that's going to just kind of be canned, like pull it down and then some commands to get the configuration up and going?
So the Composer REST server can be installed using either NPM or Docker. I think Docker would probably be the preferred route. And then organizations should just be able to pull the Docker image or the NPM module and deploy it to whatever platform they want to run it on. In terms of configuration, it just uses connection profiles as per any other of the Composer APIs, but in terms of the passport configuration for configuring external users, that's a separate JSON document that we need to document how to use.
Yeah, okay. And the wallet concept and storing the credentials and that kind of configuration side of it?
Yes, so again, that's another piece of loopback configuration that the organization would need to provide. They would need to provide a connector and the database settings for persisting the wallet into that database.
Okay. All right, thanks.
No worries. Any other questions? Okay, so we'll move on to James, who's going to talk about the latest features going into the playground.
Okay, so if you've used the playground recently, you probably got very happy about pressing the OK button. So we've had a lot of dialogue popping up.
It might be because I just rejoined the meeting. Sorry.
Let me leave the meeting and come back in.
Those of you on the phone will be glad to know that I am investigating using a different meeting software provided by the Hyperledger Foundation. So, we hopefully won't have these technical difficulties for much longer.
Not on the phone and delighted.
Yeah, it turns out that moving pixels from one machine to another is one of the hardest problems in distributed computing.
Okay.
Way.
Yeah, so as I was saying, one of the things that we've had some fun with is sort of, I guess, progress or status dialog boxes popping up that kind of force you to press OK, which is kind of, I mean, it's nice and you know something's happening, but I'm getting bored of pressing OK. So we've got some kind of in progress kind of spinner dialogues that disappear when the action is finished, and some kind of success dialogues popping up when something's worked that just disappear. You don't have to dismiss them yourself, which is kind of a nice bit of polishing. Also, on a previous community call, we were showing you identities. That sort of work has come along a bit more. The last release had it in. Unfortunately, when you switched identity, you then had to refresh the page, which wasn't particularly nice. That should be working. So I can give you a demo of hopefully both those things. You can see the dialogues pop up as I go. So I have a version 1 connection profile set up, and when I click use this profile, I get to click which ID. Oh, it's too quick. So you didn't see the progress thing, but you can see that connection was successful. And now I can switch IDs, and hopefully this will be slow enough. You should see, there you go, that just popped up long enough to see that something was switching. And now I know, for example, that Liz can't issue IDs. Oh, this is another slight change is the participant drop down has kind of changed to kind of make it nicer than seeing the full fully qualified ID, which is what you get when you click on it. So if Liz tries to create it, she can't do that. If I switch back to the admin ID, let's try that again. And we see that the admin can do it, and I'm going to add that to my work. So the kind of identity stuff's tightened up a bit, and as you can see, I've not had to click OK just to say, yes, I'm connecting, which is pretty nice. I think
Nice.
that's the main changes coming in the next drop.
Very useful.
Great, thank you. So are there any other further questions on the call? Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we're not going to be cutting a release next week, but we are planning on testing and cutting a release tomorrow, so you'll get the latest updates to the playground that James has just demonstrated. You won't get events, but that will come in a subsequent release. So if there's no further questions... I should mention that for anyone that's going to be at Consensus next week, I'm going to be there, so if you want to come along and find me and talk about Composer, that'd be great. Happy to talk.
And you'll be running
And
hackathon, right?
yes, so I'll be helping out at the hackathon on a Saturday and Sunday, and then at Consensus itself, I'll be running at the IBM booth, and I'll be showing off a vehicle lifecycle demo that we've built. We'll be open sourcing in the next couple of weeks, hopefully. And that looks great, so definitely come along and see it if you're in New York.
That's the week after next, not next.
Oh, yeah, that's correct. Yeah, sorry. The 20th to the 24th, I think.
Yep.
Okay, thanks a lot. Speak soon.
See you on Rocket Chat.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks,